Question 1. System analysis indicates that an energy company operating in Alabama is seeking to understand its obligations and opportunities under recent national climate change legislation. Which of the following approaches best aligns with ensuring compliance and maximizing potential benefits while operating within the specified jurisdiction? Option A. Implement minor operational adjustments for energy efficiency without a comprehensive strategy, believing these changes are sufficient to meet national climate objectives. Option B. Prioritize lobbying efforts to challenge and delay the enforcement of national climate change legislation without first assessing its direct impact on the company's operations. Option C. Conduct a thorough review of the latest federal climate change legislation and its implementing regulations. Consult with legal counsel specializing in Alabama environmental law and federal energy policy, and develop a strategic plan that incorporates emission reduction targets, renewable energy integration, and eligibility for federal incentives. Option D. Focus exclusively on adhering to Alabama's current environmental statutes and regulations, assuming they fully encompass all federal climate change mandates. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough review of the latest federal climate change legislation and its implementing regulations. Consult with legal counsel specializing in Alabama environmental law and federal energy policy, and develop a strategic plan that incorporates emission reduction targets, renewable energy integration, and eligibility for federal incentives. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an Alabama-based energy company because it requires navigating the complex and evolving landscape of national climate change legislation while operating within the specific regulatory environment of Alabama. The company must balance its operational needs and economic viability with the mandates and goals set forth by federal law, which may not always align perfectly with state-level priorities or existing infrastructure. The challenge lies in interpreting and applying broad federal directives to a specific operational context, ensuring compliance without stifling innovation or imposing undue financial burdens, and anticipating future regulatory shifts. Careful judgment is required to identify the most effective and compliant strategy that considers both national objectives and local realities. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a proactive and comprehensive assessment of the company's operations against the framework established by the most recent federal climate change legislation, such as the Inflation Reduction Act, (IRA), and its associated guidance. This approach necessitates engaging with legal counsel specializing in environmental and energy law in Alabama, as well as consulting with relevant federal agencies, e.g., EPA, DOE, to understand the nuances of compliance and available incentives. The company should then develop a strategic plan that integrates emission reduction targets, explores opportunities for renewable energy adoption, and investigates eligibility for federal tax credits or grants. This approach is correct because it prioritizes adherence to national law, leverages available federal support mechanisms, and ensures that the company's actions are legally sound and strategically advantageous in the long term. It demonstrates a commitment to environmental stewardship while seeking to optimize economic benefits. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely rely on Alabama's existing environmental regulations and ignore the implications of national climate change legislation. This is professionally unacceptable because federal laws often supersede state laws when there is a conflict or when Congress intends to establish a uniform national standard. Failing to consider national legislation could lead to noncompliance, significant fines, and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach is to implement superficial changes that do not meaningfully address the core requirements of national climate legislation, such as making minor adjustments to energy efficiency without a comprehensive strategy for emissions reduction. This approach is flawed because it demonstrates a lack of genuine commitment to the spirit and letter of the law, and it is unlikely to satisfy regulatory scrutiny or achieve the intended environmental outcomes. It may also miss out on significant financial incentives offered under federal programs. A third incorrect approach is to lobby aggressively against the implementation of national climate change legislation without first attempting to understand and comply with its provisions. While advocacy is a legitimate part of business, prioritizing opposition over understanding and adaptation can lead to missed opportunities for compliance and innovation, and can alienate stakeholders. It also fails to address the immediate legal obligations imposed by the legislation. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with thorough research and understanding of the applicable national legislation and its specific implications for their industry and location within Alabama. This should be followed by a risk assessment to identify potential compliance gaps and opportunities. Engaging with legal and technical experts is crucial. The next step involves developing a strategic plan that aligns with regulatory requirements and business objectives, considering both short-term compliance and long-term sustainability. Finally, continuous monitoring and adaptation are necessary as the regulatory landscape evolves. Question 2. The performance metrics show a growing concern among Alabama's industrial sector regarding the potential economic impacts of future climate regulations. In light of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNF, which establishes a global framework for addressing climate change, what is the most appropriate strategic approach for Alabama's policymakers when considering new industrial development projects? Option A. Proactively integrate the principles and objectives of the UNF into Alabama's climate change policy development and implementation, fostering innovation and considering long-term environmental impacts. Option B. Disregard the UNF as an international agreement that does not directly impose binding regulations on subnational entities like Alabama. Option C. Implement superficial climate initiatives for public relations purposes, without substantive emission reduction or adaptation efforts to appease international concerns. Option D. Prioritize short-term economic gains for the industrial sector, implementing policies that offer immediate financial benefits without significant consideration for climate implications. Correct answer is A. Proactively integrate the principles and objectives of the UNF into Alabama's climate change policy development and implementation, fostering innovation and considering long-term environmental impacts. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate economic interests of a specific industry within Alabama with the broader, long-term international commitments and principles established under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNF. The pressure to maintain competitiveness and avoid immediate financial burdens can conflict with the ethical and legal obligations to contribute to global climate mitigation efforts. Careful judgment is required to ensure that Alabama's actions align with its international responsibilities without unduly hindering its economic development. The best approach involves proactively integrating the principles and objectives of the UNF into Alabama's climate change policy development and implementation. This means recognizing that the UNF, while not directly imposing specific emission reduction targets on subnational entities like states, establishes a framework for international cooperation and a shared understanding of the need for climate action. Alabama's policies should therefore aim to contribute to the overall goals of the convention, such as stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations, by fostering innovation in clean technologies, promoting energy efficiency, and considering the long-term environmental impacts of industrial activities. This approach is correct because it acknowledges Alabama's role within the global climate regime and promotes a forward-looking strategy that aligns state-level actions with international aspirations, thereby fulfilling a moral and implicit legal obligation to participate in global efforts. An incorrect approach would be to disregard the UNF entirely, viewing it as an irrelevant international agreement that does not directly bind state-level policy. This fails to recognize the interconnectedness of global climate challenges and the spirit of international cooperation that underpins the UNF. Ethically, it represents a shirking of responsibility. Legally, while direct enforcement might be absent, such an approach could lead to reputational damage and potential future policy pressures as international consensus on climate action strengthens. Another incorrect approach would be to adopt policies that are solely focused on short-term economic gains without any consideration for their climate implications, even if they are not in direct violation of specific Alabama statutes. This approach ignores the long-term economic risks associated with climate change and fails to align with the precautionary principle inherent in international environmental law. It prioritizes immediate financial benefits over the sustainable well-being of the state and its citizens, and it undermines the collaborative spirit of the UNF. A final incorrect approach would be to implement superficial climate initiatives that do not meaningfully contribute to emission reductions or adaptation efforts, but are designed primarily for public relations purposes. This is a form of greenwashing that misleads stakeholders about Alabama's commitment to climate action and fails to address the core objectives of the UNF. It is ethically questionable and does not represent a genuine effort to engage with the challenges of climate change. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the overarching goals and principles of international agreements like the UNF, even when direct legal mandates for subnational entities are absent. This involves conducting thorough impact assessments that consider both economic and environmental factors, engaging with stakeholders to build consensus, and developing policies that are both pragmatic for Alabama's economy and contribute to broader climate objectives. The framework should encourage proactive engagement with international best practices and foster a culture of long-term sustainability. Question 3. The audit findings indicate that a proposed large-scale industrial facility in Alabama may have significant impacts on local air and water quality, as well as on a nearby protected wetland ecosystem. Given these potential impacts, which of the following approaches best aligns with the requirements of the Alabama Environmental Policy Act (EPA) for ensuring responsible environmental stewardship? Option A. Initiate a comprehensive environmental impact assessment, IA, to thoroughly evaluate all potential direct, indirect, and cumulative environmental effects, including detailed studies and public consultation, to inform mitigation strategies and decision-making. Option B. Rely on the project developer's internal environmental assessment, which primarily considers economic feasibility and minimal compliance with general environmental standards. Without independent state oversight, Option C. Conduct a limited environmental review focusing only on immediate, easily measurable air quality impacts, assuming other environmental factors will be addressed during the operational permitting phase. Option D. Defer the assessment of potential wetland impacts to the post-construction phase, relying on future monitoring to identify and address any issues that arise. The correct answer is A. Initiate a comprehensive environmental impact assessment IA to thoroughly evaluate all potential direct, indirect, and cumulative environmental effects, including detailed studies and public consultation, to inform mitigation strategies and decision-making. Explanation. The audit findings indicate a potential gap in the environmental review process for a proposed industrial development in Alabama. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing economic development with environmental protection, adhering to Alabama's specific regulatory framework for environmental impact assessments IA, and ensuring that all potential environmental impacts are thoroughly considered and mitigated. The complexity arises from the need to interpret and apply the Alabama Environmental Policy Act (EPA) and its associated regulations, which mandate EIAs for certain projects, to a novel situation. Careful judgment is required to determine the appropriate scope and depth of the EIA and to ensure that the decision-making process is transparent and legally sound. The best professional approach involves initiating a comprehensive environmental impact assessment, IA, that rigorously evaluates all potential direct, indirect, and cumulative environmental effects of the proposed industrial development on Alabama's natural resources and ecosystems. This approach aligns directly with the mandates of the Alabama Environmental Policy Act, (EPA), which requires state agencies to consider environmental impacts before undertaking or approving major actions significantly affecting the quality of the human environment. A thorough EIA, conducted in accordance with EPA guidelines, would involve detailed studies on air and water quality, soil erosion, biodiversity, and potential impacts on protected species and habitats within Alabama. It would also necessitate public consultation and the development of specific mitigation strategies to minimize or avoid adverse environmental consequences, thereby ensuring compliance with state environmental law and promoting sustainable development. An approach that relies solely on a preliminary environmental review without a full EIA is professionally unacceptable. This failure would violate the EPA requirement for a comprehensive assessment when significant environmental impacts are foreseeable. It bypasses the critical step of detailed analysis and public input, potentially leading to unforeseen environmental damage and legal challenges under Alabama law. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to defer the assessment of potential impacts to the project's operational phase. This is a direct contravention of the EPA proactive stance on environmental protection. EIAs are designed to identify and address potential problems before a project begins, not to react to them after they have occurred. This approach risks irreversible environmental harm and significant legal liabilities for noncompliance with Alabama's environmental regulations. Finally, an approach that focuses only on impacts that are easily quantifiable or immediately apparent, while ignoring potential cumulative or long-term effects, is also professionally deficient. The EPA requires a holistic view of environmental impacts, ignoring cumulative effects, such as the combined impact of multiple developments on a watershed, or long-term consequences, such as the persistent effects of certain pollutants, would result in an incomplete and inadequate EIA, failing to meet the spirit and letter of Alabama's environmental protection laws. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to the EPA procedural and substantive requirements. This involves a phased approach. First, determining if an EIA is triggered based on the project's nature and potential impacts. Second, if triggered, defining the scope of the EIA in consultation with relevant state agencies and stakeholders. Third, conducting thorough scientific studies and analyses. Fourth, developing robust mitigation and monitoring plans. And fifth, ensuring public participation and transparency throughout the process. This systematic approach ensures that environmental considerations are integrated into the decision-making process from the outset, promoting responsible development within Alabama. Question 4. Cost-benefit analysis shows that investing in renewable energy infrastructure in Alabama would yield significant long-term economic and environmental benefits, but current state statutes do not explicitly mandate such investments. Considering the historical development of environmental law in Alabama, which approach best guides a company's decision-making process regarding such an investment. Option A. Prioritize investments in fossil fuel infrastructure, as these are more established and have a clearer historical regulatory framework in Alabama, despite the cost-benefit analysis indicating otherwise for renewables. Option B. Lobby the Alabama legislature for new, specific climate change legislation before making any significant investment decisions related to renewable energy. Option C. Proceed with the investment based solely on the cost-benefit analysis, assuming that the lack of explicit state mandates means no legal impediments exist and that federal incentives are sufficient. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive review of existing Alabama environmental statutes, relevant case law, and agency guidance to identify any provisions that could support or be interpreted to encourage renewable energy development, and consult with legal counsel specializing in Alabama environmental law. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive review of existing Alabama environmental statutes, relevant case law, and agency guidance to identify any provisions that could support or be interpreted to encourage renewable energy development, and consult with legal counsel specializing in Alabama environmental law. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing economic development with the long-term environmental and social impacts of climate change within the specific legal framework of Alabama. Decision-makers must navigate the historical evolution of climate change law in Alabama, which has been characterized by a gradual, often reactive, approach rather than proactive, comprehensive legislation. This historical context means that current legal tools may be less developed or robust than in jurisdictions with a longer history of climate policy. Careful judgment is required to interpret existing statutes and regulations, which may not explicitly address climate change, and to anticipate future legal and regulatory trends. The best professional approach involves a thorough examination of Alabama's existing environmental statutes and case law to identify any provision that can be interpreted to address greenhouse gas emissions or climate resilience. This includes understanding how historical environmental regulations, such as those concerning air and water quality, might be adapted or applied to climate-related issues. Furthermore, this approach necessitates consulting with legal experts specializing in Alabama environmental law and potentially engaging with state agencies to understand their current interpretations and enforcement priorities. The justification for this approach lies in its adherence to the principle of operating within the established legal framework of Alabama. It prioritizes legal compliance and leverages existing, albeit potentially indirect, regulatory mechanisms. This is ethically sound as it respects the current legislative and judicial landscape while seeking to achieve environmental objectives. An incorrect approach would be to assume that the absence of explicit climate change legislation in Alabama means there are no legal constraints or obligations. This overlooks the potential for common law principles, such as nuisance, or existing environmental statutes to be applied to climate-related harms. Relying solely on federal regulations without considering Alabama's specific legal context would also be an error, as state laws can impose additional or different requirements. Another flawed approach would be to disregard the historical development of environmental law in Alabama, assuming a clean slate. This ignores the precedents and established legal interpretations that shape how new environmental challenges are addressed. Ethically, these incorrect approaches fail to uphold the duty of due diligence and may lead to legal challenges or reputational damage for failing to comply with the spirit, if not the letter, of environmental protection laws as they have evolved in Alabama. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive review of the relevant jurisdiction's legal landscape, including statutes, regulations, and case law. This should be followed by an assessment of how historical legal developments inform current interpretations. Consultation with legal counsel and relevant state agencies is crucial. Finally, decision-makers should consider the potential for future legal and regulatory changes and adopt strategies that are both compliant with current law and adaptable to evolving environmental policy. Question 5. System analysis indicates that an energy company operating in Alabama is considering investments in emissions reduction projects. Given the United States non-ratification of the Kyoto Protocol, what is the most prudent decision-making framework for the company to evaluate the potential benefits and feasibility of engaging with mechanisms like the Clean Development Mechanism, CDM, for its Alabama-based operations? Option A. Focus solely on the immediate cost savings of reducing emissions within Alabama, without considering any international frameworks or the potential for generating carbon credits, as these are not directly mandated by Alabama law. Option B. Disregard the Kyoto Protocol and its mechanisms entirely, as the United States did not ratify the treaty, and therefore, no relevant considerations or potential benefits exist for an Alabama-based company. Option C. Investigate the potential for developing projects that align with the principles of the Kyoto Protocol's Clean Development Mechanism, assessing their alignment with any existing or emerging U.S. federal or Alabama state policies that might recognize or facilitate such initiatives, and evaluating their potential for generating verifiable carbon credits. Option D. Directly implement emissions reduction projects based on the Kyoto Protocol's CDM framework, assuming these mechanisms are automatically applicable and beneficial for the company's operations in Alabama, regardless of U.S. ratification. Correct answer is C. Investigate the potential for developing projects that align with the principles of the Kyoto Protocol's Clean Development Mechanism, assessing their alignment with any existing or emerging U.S. federal or Alabama state policies that might recognize or facilitate such initiatives, and evaluating their potential for generating verifiable carbon credits. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an Alabama-based energy company grappling with the implications of international climate agreements on domestic operations. The core difficulty lies in interpreting and applying the principles of the Kyoto Protocol, specifically its flexible mechanisms, within the context of Alabama's regulatory environment and the company's operational realities. The company must make a strategic decision regarding investment in emissions reduction projects, balancing potential financial benefits, regulatory compliance, and corporate responsibility. This requires a nuanced understanding of how international mechanisms translate into actionable domestic policy and investment strategies, avoiding superficial interpretations or misapplications of complex international frameworks. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough assessment of the Kyoto Protocol's Clean Development Mechanism, CDM, and its potential applicability to Alabama. This entails understanding that, while the Kyoto Protocol is an international treaty, its implementation and the creation of domestic projects under mechanisms like the CDM require alignment with national and, where applicable, state-level policies and incentives. The company should investigate whether Alabama has any specific legislation or incentives that facilitate or recognize CDM projects, or if federal U.S. policies, even if the U.S. is not a signatory to Kyoto, indirectly influence the viability of such investments. This approach prioritizes informed decision-making by seeking to integrate international principles with the practicalities of the local operating environment, focusing on tangible project development and potential carbon credit generation that could be recognized under a future or analogous domestic framework. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that the Kyoto Protocol's mechanisms, such as the CDM, are directly enforceable or automatically applicable within Alabama, without any specific enabling legislation or federal policy integration. This ignores the reality that international treaties require domestic ratification and implementation. Another flawed approach is to dismiss the Kyoto Protocol entirely due to the United States non-ratification. While the U.S. did not ratify Kyoto, understanding its mechanisms can still inform domestic climate strategies and potential future international agreements. And some U.S. entities may still engage in voluntary carbon markets influenced by Kyoto principles. A third incorrect approach is to focus solely on the financial implications of emissions reduction, without considering the regulatory and operational feasibility of implementing projects that could qualify under international mechanisms, or to invest in projects that do not align with any recognized carbon accounting framework, rendering any emissions reductions unquantifiable or unrecognized. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama's energy sector facing such decision should adopt a framework that begins with understanding the specific international agreement's objectives and mechanisms. This should be followed by a rigorous analysis of how these international principles interact with existing and potential U.S. federal and Alabama state environmental laws and regulations. The next step involves a feasibility study of potential projects, assessing their technical viability, economic potential, and crucially, their eligibility for recognition under relevant carbon accounting standards or market mechanisms, whether domestic or international. Finally, a risk assessment should be conducted, considering regulatory changes, market volatility, and the long-term strategic alignment of any investment. Question 6. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need to understand how Alabama's climate change mitigation strategies should align with national climate policies. Considering the federal structure of the United States, what is the most prudent approach for Alabama's state agencies to take when developing and implementing climate change policies? Option A. Assume that all federal climate change proposals will be fully enacted as presented and immediately adjust Alabama's plans to mirror these proposals without further analysis. Option B. Focus exclusively on existing Alabama climate laws and regulations, disregarding any new federal directives until they are definitively codified and enforced. Option C. Prioritize the development and implementation of Alabama's climate initiatives based solely on state-level priorities, treating federal climate policies as optional guidelines. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive review of all enacted and proposed federal climate legislation, executive orders, and agency regulations to identify direct applicability and integration points with Alabama's climate action plans. Correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive review of all enacted and proposed federal climate legislation, executive orders, and agency regulations to identify direct applicability and integration points with Alabama's climate action plans. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the complex interplay between state-level climate initiatives in Alabama and overarching federal climate policies. The challenge lies in identifying which national policies are directly applicable and how they should inform or potentially supersede state-level decision-making, especially when there might be perceived conflicts or areas of overlap. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to ensure compliance, avoid misinterpreting federal intent, and effectively integrate national frameworks into state strategies. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough review of current and proposed federal legislation, executive orders, and agency regulations pertaining to climate change. This includes identifying specific mandates, funding opportunities, and reporting requirements that directly impact Alabama. The justification for this approach lies in the supremacy clause of the U.S. Constitution, which establishes federal law as the supreme law of the land. Therefore, any applicable federal climate policies must be adhered to by the state. This approach ensures legal compliance and allows Alabama to leverage federal resources and guidance for its climate action planning. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely focus on Alabama's existing climate initiatives without considering federal mandates. This fails to acknowledge the binding nature of federal law and could lead to noncompliance, missed opportunities for federal funding, and a less effective overall climate strategy. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that all federal climate proposals will be enacted without scrutiny or modification. This overlooks the legislative process and the potential for significant changes during policy development, leading to reactive rather than proactive planning. A third incorrect approach would be to prioritize state autonomy over federal requirements, interpreting federal policies as mere suggestions. This fundamentally misunderstands the constitutional hierarchy of laws and risks legal challenges and penalties. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic decision-making framework that begins with identifying the relevant legal and regulatory landscape at both federal and state levels. This involves proactive research into federal policy developments, understanding their potential impact on Alabama, and engaging in stakeholder consultations to gather diverse perspectives. The framework should prioritize compliance with federal mandates while strategically aligning state initiatives to maximize benefits and address unique state challenges. Continuous monitoring of policy changes and adaptive planning are crucial for effective climate change management. Question 7. Regulatory review indicates that Alabama's Department of Environmental Management is considering new strategies to control greenhouse gas emissions from industrial sources. Considering the state's regulatory framework and commitment to environmental stewardship, which of the following approaches represents the most professionally sound and legally defensible method for implementing these controls? Option A. A focus on international climate agreements and best practices from other states, without a thorough assessment of their applicability and legal compatibility with Alabama's specific environmental statutes and economic conditions. Option B. A multifaceted strategy that combines the application of best available control technology, backed standards for new and modified facilities, with the exploration of performance-based regulations and incentives for existing sources, supported by rigorous monitoring and reporting requirements. Option C. The immediate implementation of stringent, technology-forcing regulations across all industrial sectors, regardless of immediate economic feasibility or the availability of proven control technologies within Alabama. Option D. A reliance on voluntary industry commitments and best management practices, with the state offering only guidance and technical assistance without mandating specific emissions reduction targets. The correct answer is B. A multifaceted strategy that combines the application of best available control technology, backed standards for new and modified facilities, with the exploration of performance-based regulations and incentives for existing sources, supported by rigorous monitoring and reporting requirements. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing economic development with environmental protection under Alabama's evolving climate change regulatory landscape. The decision-maker must navigate the complexities of emissions control strategies, considering their effectiveness, economic feasibility, and alignment with state environmental goals, all while ensuring compliance with Alabama law. Careful judgment is required to select an approach that is both legally sound and environmentally responsible. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive assessment of available emissions, control technologies, and regulatory mechanisms, prioritizing those that offer the most significant and verifiable reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, while considering economic impacts. This approach aligns with Alabama's stated commitment to addressing climate change through practical and effective measures. Specifically, it involves a data-driven evaluation of the cost-effectiveness and technological readiness of various control strategies, such as implementing best available control technology, backed standards for new industrial facilities, and exploring market-based mechanisms like emissions trading programs where applicable and legally permissible under Alabama statutes. This ensures that regulatory actions are grounded in scientific evidence and economic reality, promoting sustainable development. An approach that focuses solely on voluntary industry initiatives, without robust state oversight or enforcement mechanisms, is professionally unacceptable. While voluntary programs can be a component of a broader strategy, relying on them exclusively fails to provide the necessary regulatory certainty and accountability required to achieve meaningful emissions reductions. This approach risks inadequate progress and potential noncompliance with any existing or future Alabama emission standards. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to prioritize economic growth above all else, dismissing the need for emissions controls due to perceived economic burdens. This overlooks the long-term economic risks associated with climate change impacts, such as increased costs from extreme weather events and potential federal regulatory actions. It also fails to acknowledge Alabama's responsibility to contribute to broader climate mitigation efforts as outlined in state environmental policy. Finally, an approach that adopts prescriptive, one-size-fits-all regulations without considering the specific context and technological capabilities of different industries within Alabama is also professionally flawed. This can lead to inefficient or unattainable compliance burdens, hindering both environmental progress and economic viability. Effective regulation requires flexibility and a nuanced understanding of industry operations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the environmental objectives based on Alabama's climate goals. This should be followed by a thorough analysis of potential regulatory approaches, evaluating their technical feasibility, economic impact, and legal compliance under Alabama law. Stakeholder engagement, including industry representatives, environmental groups, and the public, is crucial to gather diverse perspectives and build consensus. The chosen approach should be iterative, allowing for monitoring, evaluation, and adaptation as new information and technologies become available. Question 8. Performance analysis shows that the Alabama Department of Environmental Management is considering new regulations to encourage the adoption of renewable energy sources within the state. Before finalizing these regulations, what is the most critical step to ensure compliance with the United States international climate change commitments, such as those under the Paris Agreement? Option A. Focus solely on the economic incentives for renewable energy adoption within Alabama, disregarding any potential conflicts with international treaty obligations. Option B. Implement the regulations immediately to capitalize on the perceived environmental benefits for Alabama, assuming international implications are secondary. Option C. Research and analyze how the proposed renewable energy regulations align with the United States Nationally Determined Contributions, NDC, and reporting requirements under the UNFC framework. Option D. Assume that international climate agreements do not directly impact state-level environmental regulations in Alabama. The correct answer is C. Research and analyze how the proposed renewable energy regulations align with the United States Nationally Determined Contributions, NDC, and reporting requirements under the UNFC framework. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the complex interplay between state-level climate action in Alabama and the United States commitments under international climate change agreements. The challenge lies in ensuring that state initiatives, while potentially beneficial for local environmental goals, do not inadvertently contravene or undermine federal obligations derived from treaties like the Paris Agreement. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to balance state autonomy with national and international responsibilities, ensuring that Alabama's climate policies are both effective locally and compliant with broader U.S. commitments. The best professional approach involves proactively researching and understanding the specific commitments and reporting mechanisms established by the United States under international agreements, such as the Nationally Determined Contributions, NDC, submitted to the UNFC. This approach requires identifying how Alabama's proposed climate initiatives align with or contribute to these federal targets. For instance, if Alabama is considering regulations on industrial emissions, a professional would analyze how these regulations directly support or indirectly hinder the U.S. NDC for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This alignment ensures that state actions are supportive of federal climate policy, avoiding potential conflicts and demonstrating responsible governance. This is correct because it prioritizes compliance with federal obligations stemming from international treaties, which are the supreme law of the land when ratified by the U.S. Senate. It fosters a collaborative approach between state and federal levels, ensuring that subnational actions contribute meaningfully to national climate goals without creating inconsistencies. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the perceived economic benefits or local environmental improvements of a proposed climate initiative in Alabama, without considering its implications for U.S. international climate commitments. This failure stems from a lack of due diligence regarding federal treaty obligations. It risks creating state-level policies that, while perhaps well-intentioned, could lead to the U.S. failing to meet its international targets, thereby undermining its credibility on the global stage and potentially inviting international scrutiny or diplomatic pressure. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that international climate agreements have no bearing on state-level environmental policy in Alabama. This assumption ignores the fact that international treaties, once ratified by the U.S., become federal law and can influence domestic policy through various mechanisms, including federal funding requirements, regulatory guidance, or even direct legal challenges if state actions are found to be in conflict with federal treaty obligations. This approach demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of the U.S. legal framework regarding international agreements and their domestic application. A further incorrect approach would be to prioritize the adoption of climate mitigation strategies that are popular or politically expedient at the state level, without a thorough assessment of their compatibility with the U.S. reporting requirements under international agreements. This could lead to the implementation of measures that are not adequately accounted for in national emissions inventories or that create reporting discrepancies, thereby complicating the U.S.'s ability to demonstrate compliance with its international commitments. This approach prioritizes short-term political considerations over long-term legal and diplomatic responsibilities. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of the proposed initiative against relevant federal laws and regulations, paying particular attention to any federal policies or guidance that implement international climate agreements. This includes consulting with legal counsel specializing in environmental and international law, engaging with federal agencies responsible for climate policy, and conducting thorough impact assessments that consider both local and national implications. The ultimate goal is to ensure that state actions are not only beneficial, but also legally sound and supportive of the United States' broader climate objectives. Question 9. Operational review demonstrates that an environmental consulting firm in Alabama is developing a new service line focused on climate change compliance. To ensure accurate client advice and regulatory adherence, the firm needs to establish a clear and comprehensive definition of climate change law as it applies within Alabama. Which of the following approaches best defines the scope of climate change law for this purpose? Option A. A broad definition encompassing all Alabama statutes, regulations, and common law principles that address greenhouse gas emissions, climate change impacts, adaptation, and mitigation, regardless of whether they are explicitly titled climate change law. Option B. A definition based solely on federal climate change legislation and guidance, assuming these preempt or fully encompass state-level requirements. Option C. A narrow definition limited strictly to Alabama statutes and regulations that explicitly use the term climate change or directly regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Option D. A definition that considers climate change law to be non-existent in Alabama due to the absence of a single, overarching legislative act specifically dedicated to climate change. The correct answer is A. A broad definition encompassing all Alabama statutes, regulations, and common law principles that address greenhouse gas emissions, climate change impacts, adaptation, and mitigation, regardless of whether they are explicitly titled climate change law. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an environmental consultant in Alabama due to the evolving and multifaceted nature of climate change law. The core difficulty lies in accurately defining the scope of climate change law within the specific regulatory landscape of Alabama, which may not have a single codified definition, but rather encompasses a patchwork of statutes, regulations, and common law principles. Professionals must navigate potential ambiguities, and ensure their understanding aligns with current legal interpretations and enforcement priorities. Careful judgment is required to avoid misinterpreting the breadth of applicable laws, which could lead to non-compliance, inadequate project planning, or flawed legal advice. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive and integrated approach to defining the scope of climate change law in Alabama. This means recognizing that it extends beyond direct greenhouse gas emissions regulation to encompass a broader range of environmental statutes and policies that are increasingly being interpreted or applied in the context of climate change impacts and mitigation. This includes considering Alabama's existing environmental permitting processes, e.g., air and water quality, land use planning, coastal zone management, and potential future legislative or administrative actions addressing climate resilience and adaptation. This approach is correct because it acknowledges the interconnectedness of environmental law and the pervasive influence of climate change considerations across various regulatory domains, ensuring a holistic and compliant understanding. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that narrowly defines climate change law solely by direct greenhouse gas emissions regulations is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from an incomplete understanding of how climate change considerations are being integrated into existing environmental frameworks. For instance, Alabama's regulations concerning stormwater management or the siting of critical infrastructure may implicitly or explicitly require consideration of climate change impacts like increased precipitation intensity or sea level rise, even if not explicitly labeled as climate change law. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to assume that the absence of specific Alabama legislation explicitly titled climate change law means there are no applicable legal requirements. This overlooks the dynamic nature of legal interpretation and the potential for common law principles or existing statutes to be applied to climate-related issues. For example, nuisance law could potentially be invoked in relation to climate change impacts. Finally, relying solely on federal definitions or guidelines without critically assessing their applicability and integration within Alabama's specific legal and regulatory context is also flawed. While federal actions may influence state law, Alabama's jurisdiction is governed by its own statutes and administrative rules. A failure to ground the definition within the state's specific framework risks misinterpreting or overlooking state-specific requirements and enforcement priorities. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic decision-making framework that begins with identifying the specific jurisdiction, Alabama. They should then conduct thorough research into state statutes, administrative codes, and relevant case law that directly or indirectly address environmental impacts, emissions, resource management, and resilience. This research should be followed by an analysis of how these existing legal instruments are being interpreted and applied by state agencies and courts in the context of climate change. Engaging with state environmental agencies and legal experts specializing in Alabama environmental law can provide valuable insights. The definition of climate change law should be dynamic, allowing for updates as new legislation, regulations, or judicial interpretations emerge. Question 10. The assessment process reveals that the Alabama Department of Economic and Community Affairs, ADECA, is tasked with updating the state's 10-year economic development plan. A key consideration is the integration of climate change impacts and adaptation strategies. A consultant proposes a method to evaluate the economic feasibility of investing in coastal resilience infrastructure versus continuing with current development patterns. The consultant suggests calculating the projected economic losses from sea level rise and increased storm intensity over the next 30 years under a business-as-usual scenario, and then comparing this to the projected costs and benefits of implementing a comprehensive coastal resilience plan, including elevated infrastructure and natural buffer restoration. The consultant estimates the present value of future losses under the business-as-usual scenario to be $15 billion, and the present value of the net costs, investment minus avoided losses, of the resilience plan to be $8 billion. What is the net economic benefit of implementing the coastal resilience plan compared to the business-as-usual scenario? Option A, a net economic benefit of $7 billion. Option B, a net economic benefit of $23 billion. Option C, a net economic cost of $7 billion. Option D, a net economic cost of $23 billion. The correct answer is A, a net economic benefit of $7 billion. Explanation: the assessment process reveals a scenario professionally challenging due to the inherent complexity of integrating climate change considerations into long-term national development plans within Alabama's regulatory framework. This requires not only an understanding of environmental science, but also economic forecasting, risk assessment, and adherence to specific state legislation and planning mandates. The challenge lies in quantifying the economic impacts of climate change and its mitigation strategies in a way that is both scientifically sound and practically applicable for policy decisions, ensuring alignment with Alabama's economic development goals while addressing environmental imperatives. The approach that represents best professional practice involves a comprehensive economic modeling exercise that quantifies the projected economic costs of inaction on climate change, e.g., increased disaster relief, agricultural losses, infrastructure damage, and the economic benefits and costs of various mitigation and adaptation strategies. This approach would utilize established economic forecasting models, adjusted for Alabama-specific climate projections and economic sectors. For instance, it might involve calculating the net present value, NPV, of investing in renewable energy infrastructure versus the NPV of continued reliance on fossil fuels, considering projected carbon pricing mechanisms and potential subsidies. The formula for NPV is \NPV equals \sum t equals 0 n \frac ct 1 plus RT where CT is the net cash flow at time T R is the discount rate and N is the number of periods. This method provides a quantitative basis for comparing different development pathways, directly informing the integration of climate change into national development plans by demonstrating the economic rationale for climate-resilient investments. This aligns with the spirit of Alabama's environmental planning statutes that encourage forward-thinking, sustainable development. An approach that fails to incorporate quantitative economic analysis and instead relies solely on qualitative assessments of climate risks presents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. While acknowledging risks is important, without economic quantification, it is difficult to prioritize investments or demonstrate the return on investment for climate adaptation measures to stakeholders and policymakers. This can lead to underfunding of critical initiatives and a lack of concrete action. Another professionally unacceptable approach would be to focus exclusively on the costs of climate mitigation, without a balanced assessment of the economic benefits of transitioning to a lower carbon economy, such as job creation in green industries or reduced healthcare costs from improved air quality. This narrow focus can lead to resistance to necessary policy changes by overemphasizing the financial burden and neglecting potential economic opportunities, thereby failing to meet the comprehensive planning requirements mandated by Alabama's development guidelines. A further incorrect approach would be to adopt generic climate change projections and economic models without tailoring them to Alabama's specific geographic vulnerabilities, economic structure, and existing regulatory landscape. This lack of specificity renders the analysis less relevant and actionable, potentially leading to misallocation of resources and ineffective policy development that does not adequately address the unique challenges and opportunities within the state. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured, data-driven approach. Professionals must first identify the specific regulatory requirements and planning objectives of the jurisdiction, in this case, Alabama. They should then gather relevant climate science data and economic indicators specific to the region. The core of the process involves selecting and applying appropriate quantitative methodologies, like economic modeling and risk assessment, to translate this data into actionable insights. Finally, these insights must be communicated clearly and persuasively to stakeholders, demonstrating the economic and societal benefits of integrating climate change considerations into national development plans. Question 11. The risk matrix shows a potential for significant reputational damage and regulatory noncompliance for a renewable energy developer operating in Alabama. The developer is planning a new solar farm and wants to ensure it qualifies for Alabama's Renewable Energy Standard, RES, credits, and any associated state-level financial incentives. They have reviewed federal RPS guidelines and had preliminary discussions with the local utility about interconnection. What is the most prudent course of action to maximize the likelihood of successfully accessing these Alabama-specific benefits and avoiding regulatory pitfalls? Option A. Proceed with project development based on informal discussions with utility representatives regarding interconnection and operational aspects, as they are knowledgeable about local energy market dynamics. Option B. Rely on generalized information about Alabama's renewable energy programs found on industry websites and past project case studies to determine incentive eligibility, as these sources often provide a good overview. Option C. Assume that meeting Federal Renewable Portfolio Standard (RPS) requirements will automatically qualify the project for Alabama-specific incentives, as the state's RES is generally aligned with federal goals. Option D. Proactively engage with the Alabama Public Service Commission (APSC) and relevant state agencies to confirm specific eligibility criteria for RES credits and state incentives, seeking official documentation and guidance on all application and reporting requirements. The correct answer is D. Proactively engage with the Alabama Public Service Commission (APSC) and relevant state agencies to confirm specific eligibility criteria for RES credits and state incentives, seeking official documentation and guidance on all application and reporting requirements. Explanation: the risk matrix shows a potential for significant reputational damage and regulatory noncompliance for a renewable energy developer operating in Alabama. The challenge lies in navigating the state's evolving renewable energy landscape, specifically the interplay between state mandates, utility integration, and the availability of state-specific incentives. Careful judgment is required to ensure the project aligns with both current and anticipated regulatory requirements and maximizes financial viability through legitimate incentive utilization. The best professional approach involves proactively engaging with the Alabama Public Service Commission (APSC) and relevant state agencies to confirm eligibility for the Renewable Energy Standard (RES) credits and any associated state-level tax incentives or grant programs. This includes thoroughly understanding the specific criteria for renewable energy generation, interconnection standards, and reporting requirements mandated by Alabama law. By seeking official guidance and documentation, the developer ensures that their project design and operational plans meet the precise definitions and conditions set forth by the state, thereby securing access to the intended incentives and avoiding future disputes or penalties. This proactive verification is crucial for demonstrating good faith compliance and maximizing the project's economic benefits within the legal framework. An incorrect approach would be to assume that simply meeting the Federal Renewable Portfolio Standard (RPS) requirements automatically qualifies the project for Alabama-specific incentives. This fails to recognize that state-level programs often have distinct eligibility criteria, application processes, and benefit structures that are not mirrored at the federal level. Relying solely on federal compliance overlooks the specific nuances of Alabama's regulatory environment, potentially leading to missed opportunities for state incentives or, worse, disqualification. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to proceed with project development based on informal discussions with utility representatives without obtaining written confirmation or guidance from the APSC. While utility input is valuable for interconnection and operational matters, it does not substitute for the official regulatory interpretation and approval necessary for incentive qualification. This approach risks misinterpreting eligibility requirements or overlooking critical compliance steps, leaving the project vulnerable to retroactive disqualification and financial loss. Finally, a flawed strategy would be to prioritize securing incentives based on outdated or generalized information about Alabama's renewable energy programs without verifying current regulations. The regulatory landscape is dynamic, and specific incentive programs, their funding levels, and eligibility criteria can change. Failing to consult the most current APSC directives and state statutes means the developer might be pursuing incentives that are no longer available or have different requirements, leading to wasted effort and potential noncompliance. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the specific jurisdiction's regulatory framework. This involves identifying all relevant state agencies and their mandates, consulting official statutes and administrative rules, and seeking direct clarification from regulatory bodies when ambiguity exists. A risk-based approach should then be applied to assess potential compliance challenges and financial implication, prioritizing strategies that ensure verifiable adherence to legal requirements and maximize legitimate benefits. Question 12. The control framework reveals that a county planner in Alabama is reviewing a proposal for a new residential development in an area identified as having moderate to high risk for future inland flooding due to more intense rainfall events. The county has not yet formally adopted specific climate adaptation policies into its land use plan, though state-level guidance encourages such integration. What is the most responsible and professionally sound approach for the county planner to take in evaluating this development proposal? Option A. Require the developer to incorporate specific, enhanced stormwater management systems and elevate structures above projected flood levels, and ensure these measures are clearly documented and enforceable within the development's approval process, while also initiating a process to integrate these considerations into the county's comprehensive land use plan. Option B. Forward the proposal to the Alabama Department of Environmental Management for a definitive ruling on climate resilience, deferring any local decision-making until a state-level policy is mandated for this specific type of development. Option C. Deny the proposal outright due to potential future climate risks, without providing clear guidance on how future development could be approved in a more resilient manner. Option D. Approve the development as proposed, assuming that future state or federal disaster relief will mitigate any potential damages, and focus on ensuring compliance with existing, non-climate specific building codes. The correct answer is A. Require the developer to incorporate specific, enhanced stormwater management systems and elevate structures above projected flood levels, and ensure these measures are clearly documented and enforceable within the development's approval process, while also initiating a process to integrate these considerations into the county's comprehensive land use plan. Explanation. The control framework reveals a complex scenario for a county planner in Alabama tasked with integrating climate adaptation into land use planning. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires balancing immediate development pressures with long-term, uncertain climate risks, all within a state that is actively developing its climate resilience strategies. The planner must navigate potential conflicts between economic interests, public safety, and environmental sustainability, necessitating careful judgment and a thorough understanding of Alabama's evolving regulatory landscape. The best approach involves proactively identifying and mapping climate vulnerabilities within the county, and then developing specific, actionable adaptation strategies that are directly integrated into the county's comprehensive land use plan. This includes considering future climate projections for Alabama, such as increased frequency of extreme heat events, more intense rainfall leading to flooding, and potential sea level rise impacts in coastal areas. By embedding these considerations into the planning process, the county can guide development away from high-risk zones, implement resilient infrastructure standards, and establish clear guidelines for new construction. This aligns with Alabama's stated goals for climate resilience and adaptation, as outlined in state-level initiatives and guidance documents that encourage local governments to incorporate climate change considerations into their planning frameworks. This proactive and integrated strategy ensures that adaptation is not an afterthought but a core component of sustainable development, fulfilling the planner's ethical obligation to protect public welfare and the environment. An approach that focuses solely on updating building codes without considering broader land use implications is insufficient. While building codes are important for resilience, they do not address the fundamental issue of where development is sited. Placing new structures in areas highly susceptible to future flooding or extreme heat, even if built to code, represents a failure to adapt at a systemic level and ignores the broader land use planning responsibilities. Another inadequate approach is to defer all adaptation decisions to state-level agencies without developing specific local strategies. While state guidance is valuable, Alabama's framework emphasizes local government responsibility in implementing adaptation measures tailored to their unique vulnerabilities. Relying solely on state directives risks a one-size-fits-all solution that may not adequately address the specific climate risks faced by the county. Finally, an approach that prioritizes immediate economic development opportunities without any consideration for climate change impacts is professionally negligent. This ignores the long-term economic and social costs associated with climate-related disasters, such as increased disaster relief spending, infrastructure damage, and displacement of residents. It fails to uphold the planner's duty to promote sustainable development and protect the long-term well-being of the community, contravening the spirit and intent of Alabama's climate adaptation efforts. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a thorough assessment of climate risks relevant to their specific jurisdiction, drawing on the best available scientific data and state guidance. This assessment should then inform the development of concrete adaptation strategies that are integrated into existing planning documents and regulatory processes. Collaboration with state agencies, local stakeholders, and the public is crucial to ensure that strategies are effective, equitable, and politically feasible. Regular review and updating of these strategies are also essential as climate science and local conditions evolve. Question 13. Compliance review shows that your company, operating in Alabama, has been identified as a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. The Alabama Environmental Management Act mandates a progressive reduction in such emissions. Which of the following strategies best aligns with the state's regulatory framework for achieving these emission reduction targets? Option A. Focus on operational cost reduction, assuming that increased efficiency will naturally lead to emission reductions without specific monitoring or targeted strategies. Option B. Publicly announce a commitment to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 through unspecified future technological advancements. Option C. Conduct a detailed inventory of all emission sources, evaluate the feasibility of implementing energy efficiency upgrades and procuring renewable energy, and develop a phased plan for measurable emission reductions. Option D. Invest in carbon offsetting projects in other states while maintaining current emission levels within Alabama. The correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed inventory of all emission sources, evaluate the feasibility of implementing energy efficiency upgrades and procuring renewable energy, and develop a phased plan for measurable emission reductions. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing a company's operational needs with Alabama's evolving climate change regulations, specifically concerning emission reduction targets. The challenge lies in interpreting the intent and scope of the Alabama Environmental Management Act, EMA, and its associated regulations regarding greenhouse gas (GHG) emissions, and then devising a strategy that is both compliant and economically viable. Misinterpreting these requirements could lead to significant penalties, reputational damage, and missed opportunities for sustainable growth. Careful judgment is required to select a strategy that demonstrably contributes to the state's goals while maintaining business operations. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive assessment of the company's current GHG emissions profile, identifying specific emission sources, and then developing a phased reduction plan that aligns with the spirit and letter of Alabama's climate change initiatives. This includes researching and evaluating available technologies and operational changes that can demonstrably reduce emissions, such as investing in energy efficiency upgrades, exploring renewable energy procurement, or implementing process optimizations. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the regulatory mandate for emission reductions by proposing concrete, actionable steps. It demonstrates a proactive commitment to environmental stewardship and compliance with the EMA objectives, which aim to mitigate the impacts of climate change within Alabama. This strategy prioritizes measurable progress and aligns with the state's broader environmental goals. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves focusing solely on voluntary, non-binding emission reduction goals that are not directly tied to specific regulatory requirements or state targets. While voluntary efforts can be commendable, they fail to address the legal obligation to meet established emission reduction targets under Alabama law. This approach risks non-compliance if the voluntary goals fall short of what is mandated or expected by the state's regulatory framework. Another incorrect approach is to implement emission reduction strategies that are not scientifically verifiable or that rely on speculative future technologies without concrete implementation plans. The EMA and related regulations require demonstrable progress. Relying on unproven methods or future promises without current action does not satisfy the regulatory requirement for tangible emission reductions and could be seen as an attempt to circumvent compliance. A further incorrect approach is to prioritize cost savings through operational changes that inadvertently increase GHG emissions, even if not directly regulated as such. without a corresponding plan to offset or reduce these increases. While efficiency is important, it must be balanced against the overarching goal of emission reduction. Ignoring potential emission increases from operational shifts, even if not explicitly prohibited, undermines the intent of climate change legislation and could lead to future regulatory scrutiny or the need for more drastic, costly interventions later. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing this situation should first consult the most current Alabama Environmental Management Act and any relevant administrative rules or guidance issued by the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, concerning GHG emissions. This should be followed by a thorough internal audit of emission sources and quantities. The next step is to engage with environmental consultants or legal counsel specializing in Alabama environmental law to interpret the regulatory landscape and identify the most effective and compliant reduction strategies. The decision-making process should prioritize strategies that offer measurable, verifiable emission reductions, align with state objectives, and are integrated into the company's long-term business strategy, rather than treating compliance as a separate, isolated task. Question 14. Governance review demonstrates that a manufacturing company operating in Alabama is planning a significant expansion of its facilities. The company's leadership is aware of the increasing focus on climate change impacts and the need for industrial resilience. They are seeking the most responsible and legally sound approach to ensure their expansion plans align with Alabama's regulatory framework concerning climate change. Option A. Develop and implement an internal plan for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and enhancing facility resilience, without direct consultation with ADEM, believing this demonstrates sufficient commitment. Option B. Delay the expansion until specific detailed Alabama climate change regulations for industrial facilities are formally enacted and widely publicized. Option C. Proactively engage with the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, to understand current and anticipated regulatory requirements for climate resilience and emissions reduction, and inquire about relevant permitting processes and potential incentives. Option D. Proceed with the expansion based on general industry best practices and Federal Environmental Protection Agency, EPA guidelines, assuming these will satisfy Alabama's requirements. The correct answer is C. Proactively engage with the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, to understand current and anticipated regulatory requirements for climate resilience and emissions reduction, and inquire about relevant permitting processes and potential incentives. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing economic development with environmental protection under Alabama's evolving climate change regulatory landscape. The company's desire for expansion conflicts with potential impacts on state-defined environmental goals and the need for proactive adaptation strategies. Careful judgment is required to navigate the complex interplay between business interests and the state's commitment to addressing climate change impacts, ensuring compliance with current and anticipated regulations. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves proactively engaging with the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, to understand their current and anticipated regulatory requirements for climate resilience and emissions reduction in industrial operations. This approach demonstrates a commitment to compliance and responsible corporate citizenship. Specifically, seeking guidance on ADEM-established permitting processes, any emerging climate-related disclosure mandates, and available incentives for adopting cleaner technologies or adaptation measures aligns with the spirit and letter of Alabama's environmental laws. This proactive engagement allows the company to integrate compliance and resilience into its expansion plans from the outset, minimizing future risks and potential penalties. Incorrect approaches analysis. Pursuing expansion without consulting ADEM or reviewing relevant state climate policies risks violating unknown or emerging regulations. This approach is professionally unacceptable as it demonstrates a disregard for regulatory due diligence and could lead to significant compliance issues, fines, and project delays. Focusing solely on federal EPA guidelines, while important, is insufficient for Alabama-specific operations. Alabama has its own regulatory framework and may have specific requirements or interpretations of federal mandates that differ. Ignoring state-specific guidance is a critical regulatory failure. Implementing a voluntary internal emissions reduction plan without understanding ADEM reporting or verification requirements is insufficient. While commendable, such a plan may not meet the state's legal obligations or be recognized for compliance purposes, leaving the company vulnerable to future regulatory scrutiny. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach to regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Identifying all relevant jurisdictions and regulatory bodies, in this case, Alabama and ADEM. 2. Thoroughly researching existing and anticipated regulations pertaining to the specific industry and environmental concerns, climate change, emissions, resilience. 3. Proactively engaging with regulatory agencies to seek clarification and guidance. 4. Integrating compliance and best practices into strategic planning and operational decisions. 5. Regularly reviewing and updating compliance strategies in response to evolving legal and scientific landscapes. Question 15. The control framework reveals that the Baldwin County Planning Commission in Alabama is considering revisions to its coastal zoning ordinances to address anticipated increases in hurricane intensity and storm surge. The commission has received preliminary reports suggesting significant future impacts based on global climate models. What is the most prudent and legally defensible approach for the commission to incorporate these scientific projections into their zoning decisions? Option A. Prioritize immediate economic development concerns over long-term climate projections, assuming that future adaptation measures can be addressed as needed without significantly altering current zoning practices. Option B. Rely exclusively on historical storm data and local anecdotal accounts of past weather events to guide the zoning revisions, as these represent proven patterns of local resilience. Option C. Actively seek and integrate the latest peer-reviewed assessment reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, focusing on findings relevant to coastal Alabama's projected climate risks to inform the development of specific, evidence-based zoning regulations. Option D. Commission a localized, independent study that disregards the findings of broader international bodies like the IPCC, focusing solely on the most pessimistic local climate scenarios to justify stringent, potentially unworkable, development restrictions. The correct answer is C. Actively seek and integrate the latest peer-reviewed assessment reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, focusing on findings relevant to coastal Alabama's projected climate risks to inform the development of specific, evidence-based zoning regulations. Explanation. The control framework reveals a scenario where a municipal planning board in Alabama is tasked with developing new zoning ordinances to address projected impacts of climate change, specifically rising sea levels and increased storm intensity. The challenge lies in integrating scientific projections, particularly those from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, into legally sound and practically implementable local regulations. This requires balancing scientific consensus with local economic realities, property rights, and existing land use patterns, all within the confines of Alabama's state and local planning laws. The board must navigate the potential for public opposition, the need for expert consultation, and the imperative to create resilient communities without overstepping its statutory authority. The best approach involves proactively seeking and incorporating the most current, peer-reviewed scientific assessments from the IPCC into the planning process. This means understanding the IPCC's assessment reports, particularly those relevant to coastal regions and extreme weather events, and translating these findings into specific, actionable zoning considerations. This approach is correct because it aligns with the fundamental principle of evidence-based policymaking, which is implicitly encouraged by Alabama's planning statutes that aim for orderly development and the protection of public health, safety, and welfare. Utilizing the IPCC's findings provides a robust, internationally recognized scientific foundation for the proposed ordinances, enhancing their defensibility and long-term effectiveness in mitigating climate risks. It also demonstrates a commitment to informed decision-making, a key ethical consideration for public bodies. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss or selectively interpret IPCC findings based on short-term economic concerns or political pressure. This fails to acknowledge the scientific consensus and the long-term risks climate change poses to the community's infrastructure, economy, and residents. Ethically, it represents a dereliction of duty to protect the public interest by ignoring credible scientific warnings. Legally, it could lead to ordinances that are inadequate to address foreseeable hazards, potentially exposing the municipality to liability and rendering the zoning ineffective. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on anecdotal evidence or outdated local historical data without considering the forward-looking projections provided by the IPCC. While local context is important, climate change represents a departure from historical patterns. Ignoring the IPCC's projections means planning for a past that is no longer representative of future conditions, leading to inadequate adaptation measures and increased vulnerability. This approach lacks the scientific rigor necessary for effective climate adaptation planning and fails to meet the standard of care expected of a planning board. A further incorrect approach would be to delegate the entire responsibility of interpreting and applying IPCC findings to a single, unqualified board member without proper consultation or oversight. This is problematic because it bypasses established processes for scientific review and expert consultation, potentially leading to misinterpretations or the adoption of flawed recommendations. It also raises ethical concerns regarding accountability and transparency in decision-making. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that prioritizes evidence-based policy. This involves 1. Identifying the problem and its potential impacts, drawing on credible scientific sources like the IPCC. 2. Understanding the legal and regulatory framework governing their actions. 3. Consulting with relevant experts, including climate scientists and legal counsel. 4. Engaging stakeholders to gather input and build consensus. 5. Developing a range of potential solutions, evaluating their feasibility, effectiveness, and alignment with legal and ethical standards. 6. Making a reasoned decision based on the best available information and a commitment to the public good. Question 16. The control framework reveals that a large agricultural cooperative in Alabama, deeply involved in cotton and soybean production, is seeking to understand how its operations can best align with the emission reduction commitments stemming from the Paris Agreement. The cooperative's management is considering several strategies to address greenhouse gas emissions from its farming practices, including fertilizer use and land management. They are aware that Alabama has state-level environmental regulations that may be influenced by these international commitments. Which of the following approaches best positions the cooperative for compliance and effective contribution to climate goals within Alabama? Option A. Proactively engage with Alabama state environmental agencies to understand specific regulatory requirements and guidance for agricultural emissions related to Paris Agreement commitments, and integrate these into operational planning. Option B. Develop internal emission reduction targets based on a general understanding of the Paris Agreement's global goals, without seeking specific guidance from Alabama state authorities or verifying alignment with state-level regulations. Option C. Solely focus on implementing widely recognized voluntary agricultural best practices for emission reduction, assuming these will automatically satisfy any implicit requirements of the Paris Agreement. Option D. Prioritize operational changes that offer the most immediate cost savings, with the expectation that these changes will incidentally reduce emissions without direct reference to specific climate commitments. The correct answer is A. Proactively engage with Alabama state environmental agencies to understand specific regulatory requirements and guidance for agricultural emissions related to Paris Agreement commitments, and integrate these into operational planning. Explanation. The control framework reveals a complex scenario involving a large agricultural cooperative in Alabama seeking to align its operations with the goals of the Paris Agreement, specifically focusing on its commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires balancing economic viability with environmental stewardship, navigating evolving climate regulations, and ensuring compliance with international commitments that have domestic implications. The cooperative must make strategic decisions that impact its long-term sustainability and its contribution to Alabama's climate action efforts. Careful judgment is required to select an approach that is both legally sound and ethically responsible, considering the specific context of Alabama's agricultural sector. The best approach involves the cooperative proactively engaging with Alabama's state-level climate initiatives and seeking guidance from state environmental agencies regarding the implementation of Paris Agreement commitments within the agricultural sector. This cooperative strategy acknowledges that while the Paris Agreement sets global goals, their practical application and regulatory oversight often occur at the state level. By aligning with Alabama's specific climate action plans and regulatory frameworks, the cooperative ensures that its emission reduction strategies are compliant with state law and effectively contribute to both state and national climate targets. This approach prioritizes regulatory certainty and leverages existing state resources for guidance, fostering a responsible and integrated response to climate change commitments. An incorrect approach would be for the cooperative to solely rely on general interpretations of the Paris Agreement's goals without consulting Alabama's specific regulatory landscape. This fails to acknowledge that international agreements are often domesticated through national and state laws, which may have specific requirements, reporting mechanisms, and enforcement provisions applicable to agricultural operations in Alabama. Another incorrect approach would be to implement emission reduction strategies based on voluntary industry best practices without verifying their alignment with any potential state mandates or incentives related to the Paris Agreement commitments. This could lead to non-compliance or missed opportunities for state support. Finally, an approach that prioritizes short-term cost savings over verifiable emission reductions, even if seemingly aligned with broad Paris Agreement goals, would be professionally unacceptable, as it undermines the core commitment to environmental action and could lead to future regulatory penalties or reputational damage. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the specific regulatory requirements within Alabama related to climate change and agricultural emissions. This should be followed by an assessment of how these state-level regulations translate the broader goals and commitments of the Paris Agreement. Engaging with state environmental agencies and agricultural extension services is crucial for obtaining accurate guidance and identifying relevant programs or incentives. The decision-making process should then involve evaluating operational changes based on their feasibility, economic impact, and most importantly, their demonstrable contribution to meeting both state and international climate objectives. Question 17. The control framework reveals that a real estate developer in Alabama is planning a large residential project in a coastal county. Recent scientific reports highlight increased risks of storm surge and extreme weather events in the region. The developer is seeking to understand their legal obligations and best practices regarding climate change resilience in their construction and site planning. Which of the following approaches best aligns with navigating Alabama's current and anticipated national and regional climate change legislation? Option A. Adopt climate resilience strategies commonly employed in other coastal states without verifying their specific relevance or legal standing within Alabama's regulatory framework. Option B. Continue with standard construction practices based on current building codes, assuming that climate change impacts are not yet a significant regulatory concern for development in Alabama. Option C. Primarily focus on complying with existing federal environmental regulations, assuming they adequately address the unique climate risks identified for the Alabama coast. Option D. Proactively research and integrate Alabama-specific climate resilience initiatives, including any state legislation, executive orders, or regional agreements impacting coastal development and environmental standards. The correct answer is D. Proactively research and integrate Alabama-specific climate resilience initiatives, including any state legislation, executive orders, or regional agreements impacting coastal development and environmental standards. Explanation. The control framework reveals a complex scenario for a real estate developer in Alabama facing increasing pressure to incorporate climate resilience into new construction projects. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires navigating a nascent and evolving regulatory landscape, balancing economic development with environmental stewardship, and anticipating future legal and market demands. The developer must make informed decisions that are both legally compliant and strategically sound, considering potential liabilities and opportunities associated with climate change adaptation. The best professional approach involves proactively engaging with existing and anticipated Alabama state and regional climate change initiatives. This means researching any current or proposed state legislation, executive orders, or agency guidance related to climate resilience energy efficiency, or sustainable building practices within Alabama. It also entails understanding any regional collaborations or agreements that might influence development standards in the specific area of Alabama where the project is located. By adopting this forward-thinking strategy, the developer can ensure their projects align with the state's evolving environmental policy, potentially gain a competitive advantage, and mitigate future compliance risks. This approach is correct because it prioritizes adherence to the specific regulatory framework of Alabama and demonstrates a commitment to responsible development in the face of climate change, aligning with the spirit of any emerging state-level climate action. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on federal environmental regulations without considering Alabama-specific mandates. While federal laws provide a baseline, they may not address the unique climate vulnerabilities or policy priorities of Alabama. This could lead to non-compliance with state-level requirements or missed opportunities to leverage state incentives. Another professionally unacceptable approach would be to ignore any climate change considerations altogether, assuming that current building codes are sufficient. This overlooks the dynamic nature of climate change law and the increasing likelihood of future regulations or market pressures demanding climate-resilient development. Such an approach risks significant future legal challenges, reputational damage, and financial penalties. Finally, adopting a strategy based on general industry best practices from other states without verifying their applicability or alignment with Alabama's specific legal and environmental context is also flawed. Each state develops its own regulatory framework, and what is considered best practice elsewhere may not be legally permissible or strategically advantageous in Alabama. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough review of the specific jurisdiction's regulatory environment, including existing laws, proposed legislation, and agency guidance. It requires proactive research, consultation with legal counsel specializing in environmental and land use law in that jurisdiction, and a strategic assessment of potential future regulatory shifts and market expectations. Question 18. Implementation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNF, Principles by Agricultural Cooperatives in Alabama, requires careful consideration of the state's specific legal and regulatory environment. An environmental consultant is advising a large agricultural cooperative in Alabama on developing a climate change mitigation strategy. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the legal and practical realities of implementing UNFCA objectives within Alabama? Option A. Prioritize adherence to current Alabama environmental regulations without considering the influence or future implications of the UNFCA framework on state-level climate policy. Option B. Analyze how the UNFCA objectives have been translated into specific Alabama statutes, administrative rules, and state-level climate action plans, and then develop mitigation strategies that are compliant with these Alabama-specific requirements and reflect the spirit of the UNFCA. Option C. Focus solely on the broad, aspirational goals of the UNFCA, recommending mitigation practices that align with international ideals without detailed verification of their specific applicability or legality under Alabama law. Option D. Assume that federal climate change legislation directly mandates specific mitigation actions for agricultural cooperatives in Alabama, bypassing the need to investigate Alabama's unique regulatory incorporation of international climate agreements. The correct answer is B. Analyze how the UNFCA objectives have been translated into specific Alabama statutes, administrative rules, and state-level climate action plans, and then develop mitigation strategies that are compliant with these Alabama-specific requirements and reflect the spirit of the UNFCA. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an Alabama-based environmental consultant tasked with advising a large agricultural cooperative on climate change mitigation strategies. The cooperative operates under Alabama's specific environmental regulations, which are influenced by, but not identical to, the broader framework of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCA. The challenge lies in translating the aspirational goals and principles of the UNFCA into actionable, legally compliant, and economically viable strategies within the context of Alabama law and the cooperative's operational realities. Misinterpreting the relationship between international agreements and state-level implementation can lead to non-compliance, inefficient resource allocation, and reputational damage. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves a thorough analysis of how the principles and objectives of the UNFC have been incorporated into Alabama's existing environmental statutes and regulations. This means identifying specific state laws, agency rules, e.g., from the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, and any state-specific climate action plans that reflect or operationalize UNFC commitments. The consultant should then assess the cooperative's current practices against these Alabama-specific requirements and recommend mitigation strategies that align with both state law and the spirit of the UNFC, prioritizing those that offer clear environmental benefits and are feasible for the cooperative. This approach ensures legal compliance and effective implementation by grounding recommendations in the operative legal framework of Alabama. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the broad goals of the UNFC without considering their specific translation into Alabama law. This could lead to recommending strategies that are aspirational but not legally mandated or even permissible under state regulations, potentially resulting in wasted effort or noncompliance. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the UNFC entirely and only consider current Alabama environmental regulations. While state law is paramount, the UNFC provides the overarching international framework and can inform best practices and future regulatory trends. Ignoring it might lead to recommendations that are technically compliant but fall short of proactive, forward-thinking climate mitigation that aligns with international expectations and potential future state actions. A third incorrect approach would be to assume that federal climate change laws directly dictate Alabama's specific mitigation requirements without verifying their incorporation into state statutes. Federal laws often set minimum standards, but states can enact more stringent or different approaches. Relying solely on federal mandates without state-specific verification could lead to an incomplete or inaccurate understanding of Alabama's regulatory landscape. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a hierarchical approach to regulatory compliance. First, identify the operative jurisdiction, Alabama. Second, understand the specific laws and regulations within that jurisdiction. Third, consider how international agreements like the UNFC influence or are reflected in the domestic legal framework. The decision-making process should involve 1. Jurisdictional analysis, confirming the applicable laws and regulations of Alabama. 2. Framework integration, researching how the UNFC principles are implemented or addressed within Alabama's legal and policy landscape. 3. Risk assessment, evaluating the cooperative's current practices against these identified requirements and potential future regulatory shifts. 4. Strategy development, proposing mitigation measures that are legally compliant, environmentally effective, and economically sound within the Alabama context, while also considering the broader international framework. Question 19. To address the challenge of a manufacturing facility in Mobile, Alabama, whose wastewater discharge, while compliant with current Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM regulations, could potentially, under certain hydrological conditions, affect water quality in a neighboring state's estuary, what is the most professionally responsible course of action for an environmental consultant? Option A. Advise the client to implement enhanced wastewater treatment technologies that exceed current ADEM discharge limits, incorporating a margin of safety to account for potential transboundary impacts, and to monitor downstream water quality indicators in the neighboring state. Option B. Suggest that the client lobby the Alabama legislature to strengthen state laws to explicitly address hypothetical transboundary impacts before any voluntary mitigation is considered. Option C. Advise the client that since the discharge fully complies with all existing Alabama state laws and ADEM permits, no further action is required, and potential future impacts on another state are not the client's immediate concern. Option D. Recommend that the client wait for a formal complaint or notification of harm from the neighboring state or federal environmental agencies before considering any modifications to their current discharge practices. The correct answer is A. Advise the client to implement enhanced wastewater treatment technologies that exceed current ADEM discharge limits, incorporating a margin of safety to account for potential transboundary impacts, and to monitor downstream water quality indicators in the neighboring state. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an Alabama-based environmental consultant due to the inherent tension between state-level regulatory authority and the principles of international environmental law, particularly concerning transboundary pollution and the precautionary principle. The consultant must navigate the complexities of advising a client whose operations could impact neighboring states or even international waters, while adhering to Alabama's specific environmental statutes and regulations. The challenge lies in balancing the client's economic interests with the broader ethical and legal obligations that extend beyond state borders, especially when scientific certainty about harm is limited. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with both domestic and internationally recognized environmental norms. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves proactively identifying potential transboundary impacts of the client's operations and advising the client to adopt mitigation strategies aligned with the precautionary principle, even if Alabama law does not explicitly mandate such measures for hypothetical future harms. This approach is correct because it acknowledges the spirit and evolving nature of environmental protection, which increasingly recognizes that states have a responsibility to prevent harm to other jurisdictions. While Alabama's regulatory framework may focus on in-state impacts, international environmental law principles, such as the duty not to cause transboundary harm and the precautionary principle, inform best practices for responsible environmental stewardship. By recommending proactive measures, the consultant demonstrates foresight and ethical responsibility, minimizing potential future liabilities and reputational damage for the client, and aligning with the broader international consensus on environmental protection. Incorrect approaches analysis. Advising the client to strictly adhere only to the explicit requirements of current Alabama environmental statutes, without considering potential transboundary impacts or international principles, is professionally deficient. This approach fails to acknowledge the interconnectedness of environmental systems and the growing international expectation for states and their entities to act responsibly beyond their immediate borders. Risks future legal challenges, regulatory scrutiny from federal agencies or international bodies, and significant reputational harm if the operations are later found to contribute to environmental degradation in other jurisdictions. Recommending that the client ignore any potential for transboundary impact because Alabama law does not specifically address it for this particular operation is ethically unsound and professionally negligent. This dismissive stance disregards fundamental principles of international environmental law, such as the obligation to prevent significant transboundary harm, which is a cornerstone of international environmental jurisprudence. Such advice could lead to severe legal repercussions and environmental damage, suggesting that the client only implement mitigation measures if direct evidence of harm to another jurisdiction is presented, regardless of the potential for such harm, is also an unacceptable approach. This reactive stance ignores the precautionary principle, which advocates for taking preventive action in the face of uncertainty when there is a risk of serious or irreversible environmental damage. Relying solely on proven harm before acting is often too late to prevent significant ecological and economic consequences. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field should adopt a proactive and principles-based decision-making process. This involves 1. Thoroughly understanding the client's operations and their potential environmental footprint. 2. Researching not only applicable state and federal laws, but also relevant international environmental law principles and best practices. 3. Identifying potential transboundary impacts and assessing risks, even if they are not currently mandated by specific state regulations. 4. Advising the client on the most responsible and forward-thinking course of action, which often involves adopting measures aligned with international norms and the precautionary principle to prevent potential future harm and liability. 5. Clearly communicating the rationale behind these recommendations, emphasizing both legal compliance and ethical responsibility. Question 20. The review process indicates that a large industrial manufacturing company operating in Alabama is seeking to enhance its corporate climate governance and accountability. The company has identified its Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions, which total 50,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent annually. Management is now considering how to best quantify and disclose the potential financial impacts of climate change on its operations over the next 10 years. Specifically in relation to potential regulatory changes in Alabama that could impose a carbon tax. Analysts have provided the following preliminary estimates. Scenario A. A moderate carbon tax of $20 per metric ton of CO2 equivalent is implemented. Scenario B. A stringent carbon tax of $50 per metric ton of CO2 equivalent is implemented. Assuming the company's emissions remain constant over the 10-year period, what is the total potential financial impact range of these carbon taxes over the entire decade? Option A. The total potential financial impact ranges from $50,000 to $125,000. Option B. The total potential financial impact ranges from $10,000 to $25,000. Option C. The total potential financial impact ranges from $5,000 to $12,500. Option D. The total potential financial impact ranges from $100,000 to $250,000. The correct answer is B. The total potential financial impact ranges from $10,000 to $25,000. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a corporation's fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder value and the increasing regulatory and societal pressure for climate accountability in Alabama. The challenge lies in quantifying and disclosing climate-related financial risks in a manner that is both compliant with Alabama law and meaningful to stakeholders, particularly when dealing with forward-looking projections and potential future liabilities. Careful judgment is required to balance transparency with the avoidance of speculative or misleading disclosures. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive assessment of Scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions, followed by a scenario analysis that quantifies the potential financial impacts of various climate change pathways on the company's operations and assets within Alabama. This includes estimating the cost of potential carbon taxes or regulations, the impact of extreme weather events on infrastructure, and the potential for stranded assets due to shifts in market demand or regulatory policy. The company should then translate these quantified risks into financial terms, such as potential reductions in revenue, increased operating costs, or asset impairment charges, and disclose these findings in accordance with Alabama's evolving climate disclosure guidelines, which emphasize materiality and forward-looking information. This approach aligns with the principles of corporate accountability by providing stakeholders with a clear, data-driven understanding of the company's climate-related financial exposure, thereby enabling informed investment and oversight decisions. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on historical emissions data without projecting future impacts. While historical data is a component of emissions accounting, it fails to address the forward-looking nature of climate risk and the potential for significant financial implications in the future, which is a key focus of corporate climate governance. This approach neglects the proactive risk management and disclosure obligations mandated by a comprehensive understanding of climate accountability. Another incorrect approach would be to disclose only qualitative statements about climate risks without any quantitative analysis or financial quantification. While acknowledging climate risks is a step, the absence of measurable data makes such disclosures vague and potentially misleading. Alabama's regulatory framework increasingly demands quantifiable metrics to assess materiality and inform stakeholders, rendering purely qualitative statements insufficient for robust corporate climate governance. A further incorrect approach would be to selectively disclose only the positive financial impacts of climate adaptation strategies, while omitting the quantified risks of inaction or the financial implications of negative climate scenarios. This selective disclosure is ethically problematic and likely to be viewed as misleading by regulators and investors, failing to provide a balanced and complete picture of the company's climate-related financial position. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes a thorough understanding of the specific regulatory requirements in Alabama concerning climate risk disclosure. This involves identifying all relevant emission scopes, employing robust methodologies for scenario analysis and financial quantification, and ensuring that disclosures are material, forward-looking, and balanced. The process should involve cross-functional collaboration between environmental, finance, legal, and risk management departments to ensure accuracy and compliance.